back a year ago.
Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Super excited to be joined by Associate Professor Nathaniel G. Chapman, or Nate, as we will keep things casual this evening. Nate is Associate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Arkansas Tech University. In 2020, Nate published Beer and Racism: How Beer Became White, Why It Matters, and the Movements to Change It. In our quest to explore the extensive world and its connection to beer, we're looking forward to learning more about the sociological aspects of beer and how beer culture continues to change and evolve. So Nate, welcome to the Beer Bound Podcast. How are you today, sir?
Doing quite well. Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Glad you're here.
Thank you for the time, of course. Nate, we gave a little intro of you, but if you don't mind elaborating a little bit about you, your specialties.
Yeah, sure. So, excuse me, my name's Nate Chapman. I'm originally from South Carolina. I currently live in Arkansas. I moved to Russellville, Arkansas to teach sociology at Arkansas Tech after finishing grad school at Virginia Tech in 2015 with my PhD, which related to the question about my connection to beer. It actually started at the College of Charleston when I was an undergrad. We lived downtown Charleston. Our dorm was maybe a block away from a Mellow Mushroom. I don't know if you all have those in Canada, but they're gourmet sort of pizza places, but they're also known for their like amazing beer selection. So they had a 100 beer club, excuse me, that the more you drank, the more you accomplished, you got certain perks and all that. There was only one hang up. I was 18, but we went in on a rainy Saturday afternoon in the middle of March, and the bartender didn't card me. I was like, we'll just see what happens. So then I signed all the paperwork or whatever. I'm in the club, and that was my de facto ID from then on. I just said, oh, I'm a beer club member, and became like a VIP. So I started going and just trying any and all beers, you know, more like sort of from the gamification aspect of it, but then also just out of curiosity. I mean, this is all pre-Untapped, you know, I still have my actual physical, you know, paper booklet where they would stamp it every night. But I started drinking all these different beers, found styles I liked. And this is probably 2004, 2003, when I really started getting into beer. I started trading beer online on Facebook groups and whatnot when I went to grad school. I was a member of a few clubs like Casey, Rare Barrel, and a few others, going to beer releases and stuff, but was very, very active in trading. So basically kind of took the Pokemon approach. You know, I wanted to tick them all. And we started doing bottle shares that we hosted at a local bottle shop in Blacksburg, Virginia, where Virginia Tech is, and got exposed to some really great beers. And just, that was, I guess, my first like sort of entree into the culture of craft beer. But I also, in the meantime, I was bartending and working at places that had good beer selections, partly because I was consulting with them a little bit to like what to get on tap and that sort of thing. No compensation other than, you know, a couple free beers, but I in that point in grad school, you take anything. So yeah, I just drank any and all beers I could try whenever I could. I would plan trips around going to breweries and releases and things like that. So I was pretty much all in on beer from the time I used a fake ID to join a beer club.
It's a great way to get into craft beer.
It's a great tale. So we know you're a bit of a beer head, Nate. Your love of beer goes back quite a ways. But what about, so that's one side of who you are, but then your academic side as well. Can you tell us your interest in sociology? How did that begin? Your path into academia?
Yeah. So like I said, I went to College of Charleston in 2002, my freshman year, and I was totally convinced I was going to be pre-med. You know, so I was going to major in either biology or chemistry and then pick up a minor. If you don't know anything about College of Charleston, small liberal arts school, Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest universities in the country, 1770. So they're really deeply rooted in their traditions, the way they do things. So you're required to have like a minor. But there's a medical school there that's basically a feeder school, MUSC. So they said, if you want to stand out, you need to find a major that's not a science so that you'll stick out a little bit. And so I had never taken sociology. It was my spring semester, my freshman year. I was like, I'll take intro to sociology, just see what this is like. And I tell my students is now, I actually got a B- in intro. But now I teach intro. So, don't give up if you don't get that A every time. But I just thought the questions that they asked in sociology and the different perspectives, and then the different ways or methodologies to answer those questions, it just seemed to fit with how I had already started to view the world, maybe, if that makes sense. So meanwhile, I was still thinking I was going to do the med school thing. So I majored in sociology. Then I failed organic chemistry twice. So I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to go to med school. So I went all in on sociology. I started talking with one of my mentors, and ended up at Virginia Tech. And then when I was there, the grad school experience is much different, particularly after your master's. When you're a PhD candidate, that's when you sort of have to own your sociology. And one of the things I was taught, and probably the best piece of advice, and why we're having this conversation, honestly, is, be the expert. I was, I knew a lot about craft beer, and I was learning a lot more about sociology. And I noticed that no one had really done any sort of sociological analysis or looked at craft beer sociologically. I mean, as a matter of fact, my advisors and even some colleagues and friends in the program were like, oh, craft beer, where's the sociology in that? But meanwhile, I was thinking, where isn't the sociology in this, right? So fast forward to my dissertation, I decided to write about the emergence of the craft beer culture and scene here in the US, when craft beer sort of started. And then from there, one of my best friends and co-authors, he and I said, let's do an edited volume or a reader. So we put out a call for papers, and that turned into Untapped. The Untapped, exploring the socio-cultural dimensions of craft beer, I think. Anyway, you'd know the cover. It's a pint glass with a beard. Okay, so we did that, and we kind of didn't really think anything of it. And then next thing you know, it started this conversation, not just here in the US, but actually internationally. We had contributors from the UK. I actually, in 2019, was fortunate enough to be able to go to Kyoto, Japan, and give a lecture on craft beer. So I never thought craft beer and sociology would get me to Japan for free, let alone paid. So that was cool. But it was also very cool to be like kind of at the ground level with the trading and that sort of thing, but also sort of starting this conversation in academia about craft beer, and sort of in a way kind of creating the little subfield of the sociology of craft beer. So it's been a rapid sort of trajectory, but I think I owe a lot to craft beer in that sense, because bottom line, for a dissertation, no one's going to read it. You got to have a topic. Might as well do something you like. So I like beer, and that's why we're here, I guess.
Follow your passion, always a good idea. I read some of your work, Nate, and you do sort of start off analyzing your country's love affair with beer, and it going back quite sort of it associating itself to the origin story of the United States. Can you give us a little bit of context on the United States and beer? Where did that begin, with a societal lens or just a historic lens?
Yeah, sure. So I will say, so I have a co-author on this book as well, David Brunsma, who was my mentor and advisor in grad school. And when we got approached for the project, we were having these conversations because I had done my dissertation at that point, and we had sort of looked at, well, how did we get here, right? But then where can we go? Which I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But the how did we get here part, I mainly focused on 20th century and up, whereas my co-author David looked more at colonial times, times during slavery, things like that. So the real history, what we were interested in is how these stories weren't told or had gotten buried, or who was brewing and when and where and how, just really anything we could come up with. So historically, my knowledge is a bit more limited, but from 20th century on, it's quite a fascinating and rapid ride, because you come into Prohibition, and luckily you guys have never had anything like that in Canada. Well, I guess luckily I didn't live through it either, but after that, and this is where I got the idea for the dissertation, was using the production of culture perspective, which looks at social forces and structural things that are completely unrelated to cultural products, but have some sort of trickle down or sort of butterfly effect that eventually affects them. And prohibition, after prohibition, there's this mass movement to just buy up and all these small breweries. So there's tons of mergers and acquisitions. And one thing we look at is oligopolistic control. So what is the market and who are the main players? And it's actually not the big three anymore, but we used to refer to them as the big three: Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors, or Pabst, Miller. But at one point in the 1960s, early 1960s, those three firms controlled almost 91% of the total beer market. So what happens in those situations? Well, there's not a lot of innovation because it's not practical on an economy of scale to try to change a product up and lose your market share. But in a stimulating way, other than constraining the production that way, it stimulates production because it allows opportunities for niche producers to pop up offering different products. Okay, so there's one aspect, right? Now we have this highly concentrated market with very little innovation and competition. So we have opportunity. Well, where's the market? Who's going to drink this stuff? Also, though, during the late 1950s and 60s, coming out of that post-war boom, people are traveling. You also have people still enlisted in the military because we had conflict in Korea and then Vietnam. So people are traveling to Europe and they're trying these beers and coming home and realizing, I can't buy this here and I have to import it if I do want to. We're also talking about people who are pretty intelligent, chemists, physicists, biologists, that are like, I think I can figure this out. So we see the rise of homebrew clubs and those sort of organizations. So meanwhile, though, legally speaking, all this is still technically illegal. There was a law on the books that you could make wine up to a certain point, but at the time, beer couldn't be more than 0.4%. To put that in perspective, that's what O'Doul's is. So you could brew O'Doul's all day long in your basement if you wanted to, right? So the Maltose Falcons, being one of the main groups that most people would be familiar with, are starting to brew. They're having classes at night. So even college professors, which I thought was so cool, college chemists would open up the labs and the lecture halls at night and invite people and teach them how to brew, teach them fermentation science and things like that. So while all that's going on, eventually Jimmy Carter signs what's affectionately known as the Homebrew Act in 1978. And, you would suspect, okay, well, it's going to be this rapid thing. But prior to that, you had, Fritz Maytag and Anchorstein, which some would say is technically the first craft brewery, but Jack McAuliffe with New Albion Brewing. He's sort of seen as the pioneer of like bringing home brewing and putting it into this industrial way. Like he was welding his own tanks and sort of things like that. You got Ken Grossman out west with the hops thing, which is at the time pretty uniquely American to put that much hops into a brew. And then you got, Jim Koch in Samuel Adams, right? So that's when we really start to see 1980, 1981, craft beers starting to become a thing. Back then it was microbreweries, or the term craft beer doesn't show up till later. I argue there's a couple of waves to this. So that's sort of the first wave, and we see a decline in like the mid to late 90s, and then in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, we jumped back up. So just looking at the number of breweries, we eclipsed the number of breweries that we had in the US pre-prohibition, which was about 1,200 and something, 1,200 odd number, in like 2004, 2005. And then as of the time of the writing of the book, we were over 8,000. So most of this is happening between 2000 and 2020 here in the US. And that's when it just becomes absolutely rapid. And you see breweries everywhere. If there's an empty building or an empty warehouse, with pretty much you can expect a brewery to be there within a year.
Well, we've had that same sort of thing in Canada. Mind you, we're a little bit more lagging the States in that front. But yeah, any space that you can stick a couple fermentation tanks, mash tun, lauter tun, it's going to get filled. There's usually a pretty high demand in a lot of those small areas that can be, let's say relatively easily filled. some brewing equipment.
Yeah, I think you explained that really well, Nate. So we have sort of the beginning of prohibition happens, right? And what persists, I think prohibition becomes, it's about 13 years, I think it lasts, in 1930, early 1930s, right? They scrap it, but then that caveat still remains, no home brewing whatsoever up until Jimmy Carter. He gets rid of that rule. And then that sort of opens the eyes of the American public into the ability to experiment, as well as to travel overseas to get that real sort of flavors of, well, beer isn't necessarily just your typical Coors or Budweiser that you see at the supermarket. There's a whole new world of different styles and different flavors to really experiment, which is really cool. So
one thing to add
go
to
ahead.
that though, because you made a great point. Like, so now people's interests are peaked, right? But the other sort of legacy of prohibition, and the one that I think is probably the most problematic, and what we point to in the book as well, as being one of the main sort of limiting or inhibiting factors from people of color enjoying craft beer and participating in the culture, is the 3-tier distribution system. And I'm not sure if you have anything like that in Canada, but alcohol, once prohibition was done away with, the repeal of prohibition, they instituted the 3-tier distribution system, which says one person produces it, that gets handed off to a wholesaler or distributor. There's your second tier. That wholesaler distributor then takes it to a retailer, which is the 3rd tier, then gets to the consumer. Now, yes, there are special licenses you can get to sell your own beer at your brewery, things like that. But if you want your beer distributed, so what that introduced is a power structure that's not really got any skin in the game except to make money off your product, right? They're not producing it. They're not assuming any loss or cost in that way. And what we found is in terms of how that's played with race is, one, at all 3 tiers of the 3-tier system, there's no representation. So Black people were being blackballed by the labor unions, so they couldn't get jobs in breweries post-prohibition. There were plenty of jobs to be had, but the unions organized around and would not hire Black workers. But one that sticks out the most to me is the marketing and the distribution aspect. So when we interviewed distributors and wholesalers, they have a limited budget per quarter or something that they can spend on advertising and marketing. So when you see all the signs and the neons and the giveaways and all that kind of stuff, the beach balls, whatever, in a beer, that's coming out of their budget to hype up a product, right? So why is it I can go to, a nice grocery store and have a fine craft beer selection, a lesser quality grocery store, that craft beer section sinks a bit, and then go to a gas station, corner store, and you're lucky if you can find, a tall boy of Sierra Nevada or something. And so listening to that, those conversations we had, and realizing that there was a lot of stereotypical views that were sort of, not just influencing what products they produce, but also perpetuating this structural inequality, like within the industry. So I'm not going to bring one of the quotes here. I'm not going to sell that product there because those people can't afford it, and what was most interesting to us was looking at all the steps throughout that process. Like, okay, well, if it's not just available to you, that's fine. That's one thing. But then we're asking these questions. Why does beer have to be inclusive or diverse? People just like what they like. But to us, we were thinking, well, as sociologists, people don't just like what they like what's available to them, and they like what they're told to like, and these sort of things. So we were arguing, I think somewhat effectively, hopefully, that this was almost intentional in a way. These people have been excluded, these groups have been excluded for 100-something years of what modern beer would be. So it was interesting to see just the level and the power of all these other structural forces within that 3-tier distribution system being able to influence the tastes of an entire population.
Yeah, obviously a big portion of your research, Nate, is on the racial dynamics and the sort of dissecting the sort of the racial divide between the racial divide that exists in the culture of beer in the United States. And you talk about stereotypical images that still permeate today of when you think of craft beer, you think of like a white man with a big beard.
Us
And
three.
that's, yeah, I know. Exactly. Weird,
Yeah.
weird how that's come to play out. Yeah. But where did these come from? I mean, you talk about the 3-tier system, which is really fascinating. And you talk a lot about marketing and advertising and how that's geared to more towards the white population of the United States. But where did that come from? I mean, if you're only looking to make a buck in this massively competitive marketplace, why leave out anyone in terms of getting a higher market share?
Yeah, so if I understand your question, because one is, why would the brewers and others not want anybody to buy the product? But also, are you asking about how that stereotype of us, what we look like, how that?
I blended those two questions quite imperfectly, okay. But you got it. Yeah.
All right, right on. So the first answer is producers don't actually want everyone to buy their products, because the simple fact is craft beer is way more expensive. So if I knew nothing about beer and I go to a gas station or even a liquor store, or corner store, whatever, and I've got $15 to have a couple drinks tonight, and I see a 6-pack of double IPA, or I see a 15-pack of PBR, what do you think I'm going to risk it on? You know, so part of it is just not having access to those things, like seeing them, understanding what they are, but they're also not approachable. That craft beer cuts a lot of people out of its market because of the price. And that's why you see here, at least here in the US, you know, your typical craft beer drinker, not only do they look like us, but they're educated, they're typically middle class and college educated. And you're seeing more and more their families. That's another issue I'm wanting to explore at some point, is how breweries are becoming daycare centers, basically family fun centers, you know, and it's sort of transformed from a bar to bring the yuppie kids, the next generation of consumers, you know. But in that sense, I think just based on what craft beer is, it is cost prohibitive to a lot of people, and that prevents them from, you know, even trying it. Because if you were going to even try a new food that was really expensive and you knew nothing about it, you know, there's not a lot to go off of there. So there's that. As far as the stereotype of, you know, I looked to the Super Bowl ads from a few years ago that Budweiser did. It was this all-out attack campaign. I want to say it's like 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, where they had people at a bar drinking Budweisers and Bud Lights, having a good time. And then there was a guy wearing a vest and a hat. He might even had a monocle, you know, and a waxed mustache. And he's like sipping, and they're like, go enjoy your, you know, peach spiced Hefeweizen, some whatever, insert every beer keyword thing. And, you know, that caught my eye, because I was like, wow, they're not only saying that if you're drinking craft beer, that's the only way you can do it. So they're painting this picture that craft beer drinkers are snobs and are elites, which is directly related to the cost, right? That's not a big leap for people to make. Oh, you can pay $5 for a beer per beer, you know? So what about the other is the emasculating of that sort of like hipster trope, you know, making them look more feminine, sipping and savoring, right? Because some of my other work is on gender dynamics in craft beer as well, right? And that's a whole nother deal. That's another podcast, which I'd be happy to do with you. But you know, the look of the hipster guy, it became almost like this sort of patriotic thing too. Like, it's not American to drink not American beer. Like, you should only drink rice-based and corn-based lagers produced in the German tradition by 3 companies. So, because to me, craft beer in and of itself, like the beer itself, is really a true expression of like what we would call, you know, like the American dream, and that sort of idea. Like, you know, if you work hard, you can start a business, you can do that. Now, certainly as a sociologist, I could poke holes through that all day, but what it manifests itself in terms of the beer is a lot of experimentation, right? And thinking back to when I said those 3 companies controlled so much, those firms, you could experiment, and if it didn't work, it takes 4 weeks to brew another one, So beer is a unique product in that way, that you're able to experiment, try things, and push the envelope with minimal costs, right? Whereas if Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch wanted to brew an IPA tomorrow, they're going to have an international board meeting and retool all their factories, right? So it also became associated with a sort of hipster thing, like I'm too good for regular beer. And then we just end up with this sort of trope of what everyone thinks a hipster sort of looks like. And big beer kind of used that image to try to sway people from drinking. You don't want to look like this at the bar. You want to look like this, having fun, drinking a Budweiser and all that. So it's kind of a weird phenomenon, because I think now craft beer has gotten a bit like more elite, and people do sort of treat it a bit more like cultural capital, cachet, whatever you want to say. And it kind of has lost just the drinking part of it. I wouldn't say that's true for every craft beer drinker, but there's tiers of involvement, like not everybody trades beer online, but I don't know. It's becoming, in the true American sense, it's gotten way too big, way too fast. And I think our bubble has probably burst here.
It's an interesting point. So maybe, I guess, to that point, what you're saying is almost like with that 3-tiered system and those companies that were basically, directing where beer goes and who drinks it, almost like creating teams, to your point with that commercial, right? You get that hipster beer drinker who's on quote unquote the bad team in their eyes, and then the regular old Joe who can drink a good old fashioned lager and fit in with the rest of the crowd. But with craft beer obviously gaining market share over the last little while, do you see that maybe changing, like the 3-tiered system and those guys opening up a little bit, maybe changing the narrative there?
Well, this is the beauty of the 3-tier distribution system. If you're the wholesaler or distributor, you're winning no matter what. You want them both to be successful, because you can't brew and sell. They have to go through you as a middleman. So it only works to their benefit if there's a fight. As far as producers, in my other research I've done, I also look at authenticity and space and place as it relates to beer and the local, and how we attach meaning and construct meaning within the craft beer culture, I guess you could say. And one of the things that really sticks out is when a brewery wants to expand, like now all of a sudden it loses its credibility, right? Like Sierra Nevada opened up an East Coast brewery and distributing plant in Brevard, North Carolina. Wicked Weed, who was like the darling of craft beer in the US, had a killer sour program. Guess what? They still make killer sours. Got bought by AB InBev, and then no one would drink it anymore. All of a sudden it loses its credibility. But it only loses its credibility with a few people, those elites, right? The people who want to drink craft beer because they think it's cool and want to fit in, and those young urban professional types, they're still going to go,
Right.
And which is another reason why you see them sort of switching to this more family open atmosphere with like the Mega Jenga and Connect Four and a sandbox or playpen, whatever, right? We actually did see a fun story. There's a brewery in Arkansas. Their children's area was a chicken wire fence underneath the stairs to go up.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I mean, and they were serving, we went for a barley wine release, and I'm like, so mom and dad are over here pounding these pours of barley wine while the kids are literally under the stairs in a chicken wire pen, but I think the wholesale distributors win in that instance. Who loses, I think, is honestly the consumer, because what we end up getting is this almost space race type thing where it's how can I out beer the other small producers. And you get a lot of people who jump into the game that don't have the skills, the talent to brew, but they've got money. And if you're opening a brewery to make money, it's going to fail. If you're opening a brewery because you like beer and you love brewing, you've got a much better shot right out of the gate. So, speaking of Sierra Nevada, like we said earlier, I mean, the way that I've seen beer go in the US, which is why I think we're kind of now in the decline with trends, and then brewery openings have declined, but brewery closings have increased over the last 3 years, not just because of COVID, but we've always pushed everything to the extreme. Are you all familiar with Stone Brewing out of California, out of San Diego?
Yeah.
So they had a beer called Ruination IPA, if you're familiar. And on the back, it says, this many IBUs, and they've got their whole Stone spiel, but the whole idea was to make a beer so bitter that it wrecked your palate, and then you can't taste anything else. Because, you take a couple IPAs, I mean, you got to go like, scrape your tongue to be able to taste anything the rest of the night,
Can be
But
tough.
that was the thing. How far can we push it? So what do we see in the meantime between that? Started barrel aging beers. Let's ramp it up that way. Then, well, let's add coffee to it. So you have Bourbon County coffee, barrel aged coffee stout. Now I mean, I literally a few years ago had a barrel aged stout that had 500 pounds of birthday cake in it. They just dumped birthday cake in it. Did it taste good? Sure. Is it still beer? I don't know. And then the hazy IPA thing that are going for 0 IBUs. Let's see how not bitter we can make it and focus on just the floral. And then, it just became, how far can we push these extremes? So one thing that does give me a little bit of hope about it is over the last few years, these more traditional styles have become much more appreciated, like a Kolsch, a Pilsner. It's not, because when you lager a beer, you cannot hide behind your bad brewing techniques, right? Anybody can make beer in their garage if you're making an ale that needs warmth, but if you want to lager, that's how you show what's up. And you're seeing all these brewers now that are really good brewers are focusing on that. A great example is Live Oak down in Austin, Texas. They've been in the game forever. One of the best Hefeweizens I've ever had, but their lager, their Kolsch, I mean, and that's all they do. They're like, we won't brew an IPA. They did eventually, but it was also excellent. So I think America getting in America's own way of beer has kind of pushed us to the point where we're like, what else is there to do? If that makes sense.
Yeah, you've exhausted all the extremes. It's like, now what? Interesting.
Nate, you obviously, a big portion of your work focuses on how we can change the way that craft beer, and as well as beer culture, I guess you can call it, all across the US, how you can break through these stereotypes and break through the current trends, as well as the past trends of it really being a white male dominated scene. Tell us a little bit about how we change this, how we make it more of an inclusive space for anyone and everyone who's interested in beer, whether it be the brewing process, whether it being an avid consumer. How do we make change in any way?
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the things we pointed to in the book too, was, there has to be access to things first. If you're not aware of products, you're not going to know to buy them, to consume them, right? If I've never heard of craft beer, so I need to see craft beer, I need to have access. So one thing is equity in that sense, and that comes to the second tier, the 3-tier distribution system, is putting craft beer in those places that you think people won't drink it. We spoke with, well, I'm trying to think if I could say his name, but it's hard not to say his name because this is public information, but Ale Sharpton, who is probably, I mean, the first for sure, but by far and away the most prolific and prominent craft beer influencer, black man. He lives in Atlanta. But even outside of that, I would say he's like one of the top 10 probably beer influencers, period, regardless of race. But he kind of opened our eyes to this, because we asked him and several other influencers, like, well, how do you get the beer there then if you can't influence the distributors? So his idea was he would go get 6-packs and take them to barbershops in downtown Atlanta and give people free beer. Hey, I'd like to try this beer with you. You want a beer? Drink this. And educating people, because, beer as a cultural object is something that we associate with working class, blue collar. I mean, I had a fill in the blank day. I need a beer, or I cut the grass outside. I just want a cold beer. It's just this ubiquitous thing that everybody does, but actually not everybody does it. And not everybody thinks about it the same way. So getting beer in places where people can see it, having access to it, is the first thing. But and let me preface this by saying, I don't think any of these independent of themselves are the answer. I think these things really do have to work at all 3 phases of the 3-tier distribution system. But another main one is representation. If you don't see people in that industry Like I mentioned the union blacklists. If other people that look like you aren't doing that, and that goes for women as well. Think about the Pink Boots Society that tries to increase the visibility of women in brewing. Then you're probably not going to do it. But that also goes down to the consumption. So, when we were writing the chapter about gentrification and some of my other pieces on space and place, if I was just in Milwaukee this last week, for instance, and I walked by a club and I didn't see anyone that looked like me in there, and I didn't go in, right? But if I walk by a brewery, I'm going to see 95% of the people are going to look like me. I'm going to feel much more comfortable going in. So that relates to Elijah Anderson's work, White Spaces, where these spaces and places with the attached meaning, they signal to people that this is a space for us, not for you, just because you don't see them there. And that goes from consumers being in there, but also the bar staff, the tap room staff, the kitchen staff, even, so representation would be the other. But what I would say more positively that I think is happening is in the age of social media, which ironically I'm not on, and the last part of the title of the book, the movements to change it, was this hashtag new narrative, hashtag blacks love beer, hashtag brown people love beer, things like that. There were some prominent voices that were coming out and saying like, yeah, we do actually like this beer. So it kind of, I wouldn't say culminated in, but one of the big sort of seminal moments was the Fresh Fest that was put on, which unfortunately the two founders have different views on how that started and who should get the credit. So there will not be another Fresh Fest, but it was a celebration of Black brewers and Black beer. And they had a bunch of hip hop groups and stuff. It was still actually attended by more whites than blacks probably, right? And it featured white brewers as well, right? So you got one side of the industry saying, well, this is great. We got all these different players in the game. But then you got consumers saying, well, why does my beer have to be about race? Like, this is racist if you only had Black brewers. So I think the other thing is there's still a lot of misunderstanding and ignorance surrounding race in the US particularly, and our legacy with that. And it varies by region, I live in the South, so I don't see many Black people when I go to a brewery. I remember going to Other Half in Brooklyn a few years ago for a conference and saw a dozen or so, Black or brown people. And I was like, these would be unicorns where I live, right? There might be 12 people in the whole state. I'm exaggerating, but so I think we can make strides by bringing awareness to this stuff, but it's also, we have to change the way consumers and lay people view race and understand how race and racism don't just affect, like affirmative action, but really everything we do, from our musical taste, our beer taste, to what we watch on TV. So it's a multi-pronged sort of attack. I don't know that there's one answer. If I could, I would start a team to just start attacking it all from the outside, I guess.
That's a good point. Like down at the consumer level, it's almost a little more deep rooted. It's not necessarily who's producing the beer and distributing it, but the consumer themselves. And I know there's been strides made, especially, we have a small craft beer bubble and people we know and brewers we know. And there's actually a company called Beer Diversity. Her name's Ren Navarro, who runs that. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but in any case, she's done a lot of great things with, trying to help brewers and I guess maybe producers and things on that end, which is great. But yeah, I guess you have to kind of think of it on both ends. It's not always just the producers and distributors, et cetera, but working with your consumer to sort of maybe change their mentality. So that's an interesting take. And yeah, that's actually probably the first time I've looked at it in that lens. So it'd be interesting to look into that a bit more and see how we could try and change the narrative in the consumer's mind.
Nate, are you optimistic at all with change? We spoke, I guess, looking at the trends, do you see, you compared the state to which you live in now, Arkansas, to a place like New York City. I mean, the trends of a more densely urban location like New York is probably different from a place like Little Rock, Arkansas, or something like that. I guess, are you optimistic? we interviewed a writer and content creator. Her name's Stephanie Grant. She's based out of Atlanta, and she spoke quite beautifully and optimistically about the growth of Black brewers and the Black population of the city really doing a phenomenal job in making their mark and creating their own scene that's run sort of consistent with the other breweries in the city, but also has its own special characteristics to the breweries that are popping up, owned by Black-owned brewers and in the city. So I guess speaking to Stephanie about that really gave me hope, but I wanted to know your perspective on, obviously the United States is an extremely large and complicated country, and every state has its
politely.
every state has its own interesting characteristics and unique features, and like you said, places that are more perhaps liberal minded and places that are more conservative minded and places that are more densely populated and places that are more rural. They're going to have different ideas, and change is going to happen slower or faster in different places. But how optimistic are you on change?
I'll answer that in two ways. One is about beer itself, but the other is, and this is kind of like what when Dave and I were pitching this idea and started down the journey, I was like, this book might as well be called Fill in the Blank and Racism, because what we were trying to argue is that if you can look at such a mundane, everyday, ubiquitous thing like a beer, and see the structural racism involved, and then how that has played out over years to the point that an entire portion of the population, which from a business aspect, you would want to buy your product, right? See also malt liquor, though. They were still getting money from them, by the way. But anyway, I think it's really more about, do I feel optimistic about race relations in the US? Because to me, it was never really about beer, but beer was a bridge that we could connect with the non-academic reader, something everyone's familiar with. And our hope was, if I can demonstrate and evidence to you that there's serious structural racism and inequality in just beer, and a simple question, why don't Black people drink craft beer, which is how we started this whole thing. And that article by Dave Infante, friend of mine, if you aren't familiar with his stuff, he writes for Thrillist and Draft Mag, Infante. He's out of Charleston. Great writer, freelance journalist. But we started use that as inspiration, and I think there's two questions there. I'll come to the beer thing, which is what we're mainly talking about. But ultimately, I think it does come down to how we view race. We got a lot of pushback and negative feedback from the book. Nothing compared to the positive that we got, for sure. But to give you an example, I won't use the blog name, but it's a really probably the biggest beer blog in the US, that suggests that maybe you shouldn't drink beers. Wink, wink, right? If you follow that, that's the podcast name. Or you don't know what I'm talking about at all, do you? Okay. Do you know Don't Drink Beers, that old blog? He was like the first beer blogger in the US.
I can't say that I do, but
oh wow,
but
okay.
I guess we should. Do you,
look
Garrett?
that up.
Yeah, you should. Okay, well then you should check out Don't Drink Beer is his handle. But he's the biggest beer blogger in the US, and he's got an international audience. And I sent him a copy of the book because on his podcast, Malt Couture, he's got a huge audience, but he was willing to engage in these things. He's a lawyer person. His name's Alex Kidd, really sharp guy, man. And I said, let's send him a copy of the book. We did. He posted it, and I think 4,000 something views and comments, and thousands of shares. So we start looking at the comments, and one thing is people like, this is so great, we need to have these conversations, which I would say overwhelmingly is how most people feel about it. We've actually spoken to Master Brewers Association multiple times and helped them with their task force on ways to increase diversity and inclusion. But then you get some that are sort of what we would call the colorblind racist, where it's just beer, man. Why does it always have to be about race? But then there was a much darker side where, you know, we actually were getting death threats and showing up on like 4chan. My co-author, who I warned him not to post selfies and stuff, posted a very unflattering picture of himself. He doesn't know how to take a selfie anyway, and got memed to the point where, I mean, he canceled, like terminated all his social media. I mean, like tens and thousands of shares, because then we got lumped into this sort of like anti-wokeism sort of umbrella, right? And it no longer was about beer or our book or pointing this out. It was just, we're one more set of academics who are saying that we should be more inclusive and diverse and think about structural inequality, right? Like, oh, so there's that side. Culturally, I don't share that optimism, especially given the last 5 years in our country, from 2016, really 2015 on, and what's happening right now. No, I do not share that person's optimism in that sense. I won't say that that person's naive, but I do think if you're only focusing on the beer itself, sure, I'm optimistic there, but at the same time, that comes at a cost, because I mentioned gentrification earlier. Where do you put a brewery? You know, and if you want to get a cheap place, you're going to get it in some rundown part of town. But what people don't realize is, in order to create a new place, you must also displace someone else. So what that means culturally is a space is just some dimensionally defined area. It becomes a place when we attach meaning to it. This is a classroom. This is a brewery. This is a church versus this is a 30 by 30 square room, right? So then when you have an existing business there, or community center, or values like attached there and meaning, and you take that out and replace it, what signal is that sending to the people who were displaced, that they're not welcome here and that you don't care, right? So I think craft beer has a serious problem with that as well. They've not done the work to try to connect to these people. And part of that is when you're talking about these smaller operations, well, we're selling out of our beer every week. Our brunch is packed. Our backyard is full. We've got food trucks, yada, yada. We're making money. So clearly people want it. But I don't think that those brewers and taproom owners and things are really looking at who is consuming that and are really engaging in the outreach. To me, one of the best ways to do that is boots on the ground, like Al Sharpton. Take beer to where it's not at, and not necessarily as like I want to be, you know, a social justice warrior or whatever the term you want to call it. But if you really care about craft beer and you want people excited about it, you want to tell everybody about it. I'm a huge Fish fan, and I used to tell people all the time, like, hey man, you got to check this band out. Check this band out. I'm playing live shows for them. They're like, I just don't dig it, man. But at least I'm exposing it, right? And same as religion, you know, like, get people so hyped up about it and show them what it is and how awesome it is. I think all that stuff kind of has to happen together. I don't see one of those pieces solving the puzzle necessarily, but I have more hope in the latter than I do the former.
Maybe, and I'm being the devil's advocate here, but maybe craft beer is just a negative force. You talk about it. There is the trend of gentrification, like craft breweries do have that association of like, oh, let's find the cheapest real estate with the largest amount of space, which is typically a lower economic neighborhood. And then the craft beers move in, and then the Starbucks moves in, and then the little boutique shops move in.
Bagel shops,
whatever. Have the people listening to Fish walking down the street. So yeah, maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's not a positive force, craft beer. I mean, not to mention it is alcohol after all, let's go back to 1920, which had a lot of negative attributes attribute to it. But maybe this is a bold question, but is craft beer worth saving, Nate?
I will say this with complete and total honesty. That is the best question that I've had on any of these interviews or anything that we've done, because to me, I that's something I've thought myself, but that's not necessarily the cool thing to say. You know, and to answer that simply, no, I don't think craft beer is worth saving as it is. If we're talking about just craft beer, not the culture surrounding it, the business and all that, which I don't really know how you can extricate those two from that. Then no, I don't think it's worth saving, because I think in fact it perpetuates elitism, classism, sexism, and racism, in my opinion. But what I say, like, just to give you an example, you know, I often told by an anthropologist friend and advisor of mine from grad school, be careful researching what you love, because you might find out things you don't want to know. And that's exactly what happened to me. And also my experience trading and stuff, it got very monetized, where people weren't willing to trade beers anymore. They wanted to sell them. So people were going to beer releases and getting, you know, 2 bottles per person and trying to sell them for $200, $300, $400 just to make money. And I was like, I didn't get into this to flip a profit, right? Like, I had regular trade partners all over the country, and we would just send blind boxes to each other. It's like, I don't care if my box costs more than yours. You're sending me what you think I would like. And that's what it's about, sharing beer with people. And I think craft beer has really gotten away from the beer and become more about the scene around it. And you see that with transformations of breweries into these family spaces and basically fun parks. But also just pushing the boundaries of beer and making it so weird. Like, oh, I had a beer with a birthday cake in it. You know, well, who cares, right? So I think beer itself is worth saving, but it would take a lot of reckoning and what we would say here in the South, coming to Jesus meetings with brewers and people who are trying to make money, to say, like, if you're really about this, if you're really about change and you want to do this, this is what you got to do, and it's going to cost you, you know. I will say, on the positive side, overt like displays of racism, like I think it was Lakeview Brewery outside of Chicago. I think it was in Illinois or maybe Michigan. It was in Michigan. It came out with a beer called Flint, Michigan Tap Water, and called Black Stouts Matter. And it's like this, trying to play on the fact that, you know, craft beer brewers are a little bit more, you know, clever and that, and you're trying to be kitschy, funny, whatever. But, you know, that brewery went out of business before they even opened because of the backlash. But on the other side of that, you got founders who at one point, Comstock, Michigan was one of the darlings of craft beer before they went super national. But then you find out that somebody sued them for, you know, blatant workplace discrimination, you know, and won the lawsuit, you know. So I don't know how to save it, because again, I don't think it's really actually about beer so much as it is about race. But we can see beer, like any other product, really can illuminate or elucidate for some people who can't see it at all, these structural issues. So that's my actual hope for beer and craft beer, is that we can just sit down and have a beer and talk like people enjoying a beer, and get back down to a basic humanistic level of understanding and tolerance with each other. Because at the end of the day, we all do enjoy a drink after a hard day's work. So we're really not that different. So if we uncomplicate it, maybe, but yeah, this is one of the first craft beers I've had in months. I pretty much don't drink craft beer anymore because of that. Also because I live in Arkansas, we don't have that many good breweries. But even trading, I quit doing all that. It was just too much. I said, I don't want to contribute to this after I've been this critical voice. You know, I don't feel it's really genuine if I then come and then contribute or participate in it and perpetuate it, if that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah, I get where you're coming from.
Yeah, it's sad to hear, but I think you have a profound sense of, and a well-structured argument too, of the negative attributes that are associated with something that you once did love. And I think, I don't know, I share your potential lack of optimism. But if you had to look, say, I like to ask this question sometimes, but if you had to look at the market, maybe just in the United States in particular, not so global, like if you had to jump ahead 10 years, maybe to 2032, what does the craft beer scene all across the country look like? I think you sort of hinted at, you think the bubbles popped a little bit. So maybe we're going to get a little bit of a shrinking. We're going to go below that 8,000 threshold of craft brewers. Do you see maybe a steady growth, a bit of stagnation? What do you think?
I think we are hitting a point of saturation where there's too many breweries and not enough of them are good. But I do think that will level out. I think if you can make good beer and you've got a good spot that people want to go to, that they feel is local and can connect to, you're fine. But if you're making mediocre beer and you're in a competitive place, you're not gonna make it. But also, a lot of these breweries now branching out and more horizontally integrating. We're gonna also have dope food too. We're also going to have a venue for weddings and catering and do all this and bring kegs, but also branch out other styles. I mean, the seltzer market in particular, there was a huge uproar in one of our local beer groups about a year or two ago. They make some really excellent barrel aged barley wines and stouts. I mean, I would argue the best in the state. They're kind of whales in terms of like craft beer world because it's Arkansas, so there's a little bit of intrigue, but they actually hold up to, other major brewers. So it's kind of special for us to have this one thing, right? And people freaked out because they devoted 3 taps to seltzer. So, for one, I mean, it's like, okay, well, if you're a drinker, okay, then you can't get an 8-pour flight. You're going to get 5 instead of 3, right? But what it means, the implication for the business side of it is, every single one of those taps is worth money at a bar because that's finite. So if I've got them devoted to seltzers or wines on tap or cocktails on tap, which I've also seen, that limits my beer options. So I think some consumers are a bit concerned about, which I find ironic, that the experimentation would go too far, right? So I think what we'll see is almost, we hit this like crazy thing where there's these pedal bike tours that you do and a trolley thing where everybody's on a bike and everybody's just drinking. So it was just like, let's drink beer because beer is cool, to now like the brewery is cool. It's cool to go to this space. I can get wine, I can get a seltzer, I can get a cocktail, I can have good food, and I can have a good beer. So I think what probably will end up happening in terms of that type of consumption will end up back in more of like that brew pub sort of model. But as far as distribution, I think there's just going to be more and more mergers. I mean, every single one of the big players, and this is another point I make sort of a slam on the industry and the Brewers Association, is their definition of what is craft has always been sort of fluid, right? But now they've adjusted it even so much more because, and the main reason why was Yingling. They're like, well, based on your rules, we are the oldest craft beer. And they took the title from Sam Adams. And Jim Cook's got a lot of pull, and they changed it. I will also say in full disclosure that the Brewers Association reviewed our book and did not give us a positive review. But we were also critical of them. Their chief economist, Bart Watson, tried to paint this rosy picture and, throw some shade on us. But I'm like, dude, we were using your data and your diversity ambassador, right? Like, I think a lot of times the industry does things optically rather than substantively. So we'll see what happens with that. But I think as long as people are making money, they're going to find other ways to make money. And seltzers was one way to get another market segment into that brewery,
For sure. Seen them explode everywhere. So why
yeah,
not?
so it'd be less about the beer and more about the experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, Nate, that's about an hour, and I think a pretty appropriate place to stop. But we really appreciate your wisdom, your experience, your academic knowledge. We'd love to have you on again, maybe to discuss a few other of your articles as well as your texts. But in the meantime, we want to say thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it very much. Nate, Associate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Arkansas Tech University. Nate, thank you very much for your time and look forward to connecting again soon.
Cheers, guys. Thank you so much. That was fun.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.